Generally speaking, all we need to do to create a procedural texture is combining the coordinate maps with the different tools and mathematical operations that the different nodes provide us with in just the right way. The most universal skill to help with that is being able to control values exactly how you want them. That will automatically involve some level of mathematics, but that can be broken down into simple chunks. The nice thing about having a direct visual representation of what you're working on is that you can easily work in modular steps and check what the output is at any point. Because it can be extremely hard to read precise values and gradients just from the shade on your screen, I made a little tool for the visualization of values on a surface. I will be using this tool a couple of times throughout this course, but I want to encourage you to play around with it yourself as well. Let me quickly explain how the tool works. In the shader of this plane, you can see that there is a node group that takes object coordinates and returns values, which are then displayed with the view node. When you tab into the node group, you can define the texture that is returned and displayed. And the great thing about this setup now is that the value map is also used to inform this red and blue graph that you can see in the viewport here as height information. The different views that are set up by default show the plane in top view, the graph in front view, and the perspective view, where you can look around. Positive values are displayed as blue and negative values as red. That gives you very good knowledge over the value map you are generating and is a great way to debug textures and preview height maps. This tool bypasses the difficulties I listed in the chapter about the display of values. I recommend you use it to familiarize yourself with the different operations for controlling values in general, but you can also use it to help out when you're working on a shader. To do that, you can simply replace the nodes within this node group. Right now it is just displaying the x component of the object coordinates that are fed into the node group. As you would expect, the graph shows a linear curve from -1 to +1 along the x-axis. You can change the scale of the whole graph by moving this empty here, which represents the scale of one unit along the z-axis. The most basic, but also most versatile way to control values in the shader editor is using the math node. When I add one in here and click on the operation type, you can see that there are a lot of mathematical operations that can be done with this node. Again, I won't show every single one in here. I will show a couple that are useful in a lot of situations, and then I will show more throughout the course when they are needed. But feel free to check them out individually. Before I start different operations, here a quick tip. When working with value maps, it is helpful to think about what an operation does to the values 0 and 1, to have some idea of how it influences the different values. Using the add operation, as you can see, shifts the resulting gradient texture to the left. That works only because the input is the x-coordinate and it is not locked in a range between 0 and 1. What actually happens is that the values are shifted up, but because it is just a linear curve, it could just as well be shifting from side to side, as you can see here. This gets clear when I apply the add operation onto the Musgrave texture that I've been showing before. Negative values, of course, shift into the opposite direction. The subtract operation does basically the same thing, just with negative values, but by, instead of plugging the texture into the first socket, subtracting it from 1, can easily invert the value map. So black becomes white and white becomes black. The operations multiply and divide scale the values around 0 by a factor. And just as for adding and subtracting, the scaling is actually happening on the z-axis. But because the operation is applied to linear coordinate values, that results also in scaling the gradient along the x-axis. By chaining an offset operation and a scaling operation together, you can have complete control over remapping the values linearly. That means you can shift, stretch, squish, and invert the resulting gradient texture however you want to. So the position of black and white changes, but the interpolation between them will still remain linear, as long as you are using constant value inputs. A simple method to introduce some curvature into the gradient is to use the power operation. You can see that the positions of 0 and 1 stay the same, but the curve between them changes. If you have some mathematical expertise, you can use the combination of these math operations to create all sorts of polynomials, exponential functions, and whatnot. But for most shading use cases, you can get along great with the visual interpretation of shifting and squishing. A more intuitive way to remap a gradient is using a color ramp. Its visual intuitiveness makes it often the first choice for people starting out with shader nodes when they are trying to control gradients like this. The color ramp node definitely has its place when it comes to mapping actual colors to a gradient, or when you need multiple stops like this and want to change the interpolation type. But if you only want to remap values like this, I want to take the opportunity to advocate for using the map range node instead. It is much more powerful as it can deal with negative values and values greater than 1, and it also provides sockets for the different inputs, so you can actually drive them with a texture or expose them in a node group. And once you get used to the ideas of these inputs, it can become also quite intuitive. Just like what we did with just the math nodes, it remaps the values linearly to a new range, but the parameters here are just what incoming range is mapped to what outgoing range, which works much more like the color ramp than the math nodes if you think about it. You can also change the interpolation type to get a smooth curve or steps. A more loose and flexible way to control values is using an RGB curves node. It is meant to be used for colors, as the name suggests, and that makes it less optimal. But it is a great way to quickly control a gradient intuitively and with a lot of flexibility. I will show a very useful application of this method in the following chapter. One more thing at this point, the efficiency of your node tree is something you should always have in mind, especially when you are working on more complex setups. So, if possible, try using the simplest method needed for what we are trying to achieve. For example, instead of using the map range node when you are only changing the maximum input, just use a multiply node. That makes your node trees easier to read and also faster.